Chapter 1. The Encounter. It was a warm autumn day when Julian first saw her, the girl with the midnight hair and the kind of smile that seemed to light up everything around her. He'd seen her around campus for a few weeks, but it wasn't until that particular Tuesday afternoon that their paths crossed. Julian had always considered himself an ordinary guy, not bad-looking but not outstanding either. His focus was mainly on his studies, occasionally hanging out with his friends, and the rare moment of spontaneous adventure. College was a place for him to build a future. And then there was her, Lila. She was sitting at a table in the library, a book open in front of her, but she was staring out the window, lost in thought. Julian was on his way to the back of the library, where he usually studied in silence, but something about her caught his attention. He couldn't explain it, but he was suddenly drawn toward her. He hesitated for a moment, but his feet carried him closer, as if propelled by some unseen force. As he passed her table, their eyes met for a brief second. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that made him feel like he wasn't alone in the world. "Hi," she said softly, almost as if she'd been expecting him. Julian blinked in surprise. "Hi," he stammered, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't exactly the most confident when it came to talking to girls, and this one, well, she was different. "I don't mean to interrupt," she added with a laugh, "but do you happen to have a pencil?" "Yeah, sure," Julian said, fumbling in his backpack for the pencil case. He handed it to her, trying not to blush. She took the pencil and gave him a small thank you before returning to her book. Julian didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming urge to stay, talk, to find some reason, any reason to be near her. For the rest of the afternoon, he found himself distracted. His focus had shifted from his usual calculus homework to thoughts of her. Who was she? Why did she seem so familiar? He told himself that it was just a passing moment, nothing more. But when he left the library that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had changed something inside him. Chapter 2. The Connection. The following week, Julian couldn't get Lila out of his mind. Every time he walked past the library, he found himself looking for her, hoping to catch a glimpse of her sitting at that same table with her book. He was starting to feel like a stalker, but the truth was, he couldn't help it. Something about her intrigued him. There was an air of mystery around her that he couldn't quite place. It was Thursday afternoon when he finally saw her again. She was sitting at a corner table in the campus cafe, alone this time. Julian hesitated for a moment before walking over. His heart was beating faster than usual, his palms a bit sweaty, but he couldn't stop himself. "Hey," he said, his voice low and tentative as he stood in front of her. Lila looked up, a soft smile curling on her lips. "Hey, Julian. Fancy seeing you here. You remember my name?" Julian asked, surprised. He hadn't expected her to. It had been such a brief encounter in the library, after all. "Of course. You're the guy who lent me the pencil," she said, a twinkle in her eyes. "How could I forget?" Julian chuckled nervously, still not quite sure what to make of the situation. "Right. Mind if I sit?" Lila shrugged lightly. "Go ahead. I was just reading anyway." He slid into the chair across from her, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He wanted to ask her something, anything, but for some reason words weren't coming to him as easily as usual. After a long pause, Lila spoke again. "You seem a little distracted." Julian's eyes widened slightly. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just not good at this sort of thing." "What, talking to people?" she teased with a grin. He laughed nervously. "Yeah, I guess. I mean, I'm not bad at it with my friends, but you're different." "Different?" she repeated, leaning forward slightly, intrigued. "How so?" Julian scratched the back of his neck, trying to figure out how to explain what he meant without sounding completely awkward. "I don't know. You just seem like someone I'd want to get to know better. Like, you're not the kind of person I'd expect to bump into on a random Tuesday." Lila's smile softened, and there was a brief moment of silence before she replied. I know what you mean. Sometimes it feels like college is just a place where everyone is trying to find their way, but you can't really get to know anyone. Everyone's so focused on their own little bubble. That's exactly it, Julian agreed. I guess I'm just trying to figure out where I fit into all of this. Lila's gaze seemed to soften, and for the first time, Julian saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Something vulnerable. I get that. I think we're all just trying to figure things out. College isn't just about classes and grades, you know? It's about the connections we make along the way. Julian nodded, realizing how much she understood without him needing to explain everything. There was something in her words that felt familiar, almost like she had been searching for the same thing. Maybe that's why I like to read so much, she added, her voice quiet. It's like escaping into someone else's world for a little while. Julian smiled. I get that too. Sometimes it feels like the only way to make sense of everything is to lose yourself in something else for a bit. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their drinks and simply enjoying each other's company. The weight of the world seemed to fade away as they talked about everything from their favorite books to their childhood memories. Felt easy, natural, like they had known each other for years. As the conversation flowed, Julian felt a connection with her that he hadn't expected. She was different, yes, but in all the best ways. And for the first time since meeting her, he found himself wishing he had more time to spend with her. But as the minutes ticked by, he knew that eventually, they would have to part ways, like they always did at the end of these brief encounters. Lila checked her phone and sighed. I hate to cut this short, but I have to run to class in a few minutes. Julian nodded, reluctant to leave. Of course. Maybe we can do this again sometime. Her smile widened and she nodded. I'd like that. As they stood up to leave, Julian felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. This wasn't just a casual conversation. It felt like the beginning of something bigger. He didn't know where it would go, but he was ready to find out. Chapter 3: The Growing Bond. The days that followed that chilly evening were a mixture of intense connection and uncertainty. Julian found himself spending more time with Lila, but now, the weight of what they had said to each other hung between them like an invisible thread. The more they talked, the more Julian was drawn to her, and the more he felt the unmistakable tug of something deeper, something that transcended their casual friendship. Lila had said she wasn't ready, and Julian understood. He wasn't the type of person to rush anyone into something they weren't prepared for. But it didn't make the waiting any easier. Every time they sat together in the library, studying side by side, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more simmering beneath the surface. Every shared laugh, every lingering glance, every late-night conversation made his feelings grow stronger. And yet, Lila seemed distant at times, pulling away emotionally when things felt like they were about to take a more intimate turn. Despite this, there were moments when the connection between them felt undeniable. One of those moments came 2 weeks after their conversation in the courtyard. It was a Saturday evening, and the air was crisp with the approaching winter. Julian had invited Lila to a small art exhibit on campus, something that he knew she would appreciate, even if it wasn't the most typical date kind of event. Lila agreed to join him, and they walked through the crowded hall, the soft hum of chatter in the background as they took in the paintings and sculptures on display. Julian found himself watching her more than the art, noticing how her eyes lit up when she found a piece she really liked, how she would gently touch the frames as if connecting with the emotions behind them. It made him feel like he was witnessing something private, something only she could offer. Her world, her emotions, were as intricate and beautiful as the artwork surrounding them. At one point, they found themselves alone in front of a painting of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, her face turned toward the sea. The scene felt heavy with longing, and it resonated with Julian, who had spent so many of his own moments caught between what he wanted and what he was afraid of. Lila stood silently for a while, her gaze fixed on the painting. Julian watched her, wondering what she was thinking. After a long pause, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It's funny," she said softly, almost to herself. This painting. It reminds me of how I feel sometimes. Like I'm standing on the edge of something, but I don't know if I should jump. Julian's heart skipped a beat. The way she spoke, the vulnerability in her voice, made him want to reach out to her, to tell her that she didn't have to jump alone. But he held back, unsure of how to approach the situation without overwhelming her. I think I understand, he said, keeping his voice steady. It's like being caught between two worlds, right? You want to take a leap, but you're not sure what will happen if you do. Lila nodded slowly, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the frame. Exactly. I've always felt that way. Like I'm stuck between who I used to be and who I'm supposed to become. But sometimes I'm not sure I'm ready to face what's ahead. Julian felt a deep sense of empathy for her. He had his own fears, his own doubts about the future, but Lila's words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. She was afraid of moving forward, of facing whatever came next, and it made him want to protect her from it. He wanted to offer her reassurance, to be the person who could help her navigate those uncertainties, but he wasn't sure if he had the right to do so. Lila, he began, his voice a little shaky, whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone. I'm here. And if you want someone to talk to, or someone to just be there for you, I will be. Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something more. A connection, perhaps, something that went beyond friendship. But before he could read too much into it, she turned away, her gaze drifting back to the painting. I know you're here, she said quietly. And that means a lot to me. Julian's chest tightened. He wanted more than just this. He wanted to be the one she turned to when she needed support, the one she could trust without hesitation. But he didn't want to push her. He had learned over the past few weeks that Lila needed time, that she wasn't ready to dive into anything too deep yet. And so, he remained patient, even as his heart ached with the desire to know her on a more intimate level. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of art and conversation, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. When they said their goodbyes outside the exhibit, Lila gave him a small smile, the kind that was both warm and guarded. Thanks for inviting me, Julian. It was nice, she said, her voice softer than usual. I'm glad you came, he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. I'll see you around, okay? Lila nodded, but before she could turn to leave, she hesitated for a moment. Julian, you're a good guy. I'm not sure where I am right now. But I don't want you to think I'm pushing you away. I know, he said quickly, his voice steady. I don't think that. I just want to be here for you whenever you're ready. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Julian standing there, his thoughts swirling. He had opened his heart to her, laid it bare in a way he hadn't done with anyone else. But what did it mean? Was she beginning to let him in? Or was he just a comforting presence, a safe friend who would never become anything more? As he walked back to his dorm that night, Julian tried not to overthink it. He had made his feelings clear. Now, it was up to Lila to decide if she wanted to take the next step. He only hoped that when she did, he would be the one she turned to. Chapter 4, The Shift. It was a cold Wednesday morning in November when everything seemed to change. Julian had been in his usual spot in the library, buried deep in his notes for an upcoming exam, when his phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Lila. His heart skipped a beat as he read the text. Hey, can we meet up today? I need to talk. He stared at the message, uncertainty washing over him. He had always admired how Lila could go from being warm and engaging 1 minute to distant and withdrawn the next. It was part of the reason why he felt so unsure about everything between them. But this message felt different. It felt urgent, almost like she had something on her mind that she needed to share. Julian quickly typed back, Of course I'll meet you. Where? Lila replied almost immediately. The bench outside the student center. 3 p.m. Julian's mind raced as the hours slowly ticked by. He tried to focus on his studies, But his thoughts kept returning to Lila and what she might need to talk about. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them, but he didn't know whether it was for better or worse. Was she ready to take the leap they had both been circling around for weeks? Or was she about to tell him that she couldn't move forward, that their friendship was all they could ever have? At precisely 3 p.m., Julian found himself standing outside the student center, scanning the crowd for Lila. She wasn't there yet. He nervously checked his phone, then looked down at his shoes, trying to calm the wild thoughts that swirled in his mind. A few minutes later, he spotted her walking toward him. She looked different, almost like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet energy that Julian could feel even from a distance. She wore a gray sweater that seemed a little too big for her, and her expression was unreadable. "Hey," Julian said, offering a small smile as she approached. "Hey," Lila replied, her voice soft and distant. She sat down on the bench without saying much more, and Julian followed suit, his heart pounding in his chest. They sat in silence for a few moments, the cool breeze making the air feel heavier than it was. Julian could feel the tension building, could sense that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. He took a deep breath and spoke first. "Lila, what's going on? You said you needed to talk." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began, her gaze dropping to her hands. "About what we are. Or what we could be." Julian's heart leapt into his throat. Was this it? Was she finally ready to take the plunge? "Lila," he started, his voice low and careful, "if you're saying what I think you're saying, I just want you to know I'm here. Whatever you want. I'm ready." She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared straight ahead, as though the conversation was too difficult to look him in the face while having. "I don't think I am," she said finally, the words sounding like they were tearing her apart. "I really like you, Julian. More than I thought I would, and more than I think you realize. But there's something holding me back. Something inside me that makes me scared to take that next step." Julian swallowed hard, trying to control the tightness in his chest. He had feared this moment, feared that she would pull away, but hearing the words out loud hit harder than he had anticipated. He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand to stop him. "It's not you," she said quickly. "It's me. It's everything that happened before. I passed. I don't want to drag you into it. You deserve someone who's ready for everything. I don't know if I'll ever be that person." The words felt like a slap. Julian's mind raced. He wanted to tell her that he didn't care about her past, that he was more than willing to help her work through it. But he could see the sadness in her eyes, the same sadness that had been present every time she pulled away, every time she hesitated. He realized that no matter how much he wanted to help her, there were parts of her past that she wasn't ready to confront. "Is it because of something that happened?" Julian asked softly, his voice full of concern. "Is there something you're afraid of that you think will ruin what we have?" Lila took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. I had a relationship before college. One that messed me up more than I ever realized. It wasn't healthy. I wasn't healthy. And I've spent the last year trying to convince myself that I'm over it. But not yet." Julian felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to comfort her, wanted to tell her that she didn't have to go through this alone, that he would be there every step of the way. But Lila wasn't looking for pity. She needed space, she needed time. She needed to heal on her own. "I didn't think it would affect me like this," she continued, her voice wavering. "But it does. Every time I get close to someone I start pushing them away. It's like I can't help myself. And I'm afraid that if I get too close to you, I'll end up doing the same thing. Hurting you." Julian felt the sting of her words, but he didn't pull away. "Lila, I care about you. I'm not going anywhere. And if you need time, I'll give you that time. But you don't have to go through this by yourself. Whatever you're dealing with, I want to be here for you." Lila's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since they had met, Julian saw her vulnerability laid bare. "I don't want to drag you into my mess," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to hurt you. But I don't know how to fix myself." Julian reached out and took her hand, gently squeezing it. "You don't have to fix yourself alone, Lila. Let me help you. Please." There was a long silence as Lila looked at him, her tears spilling over. And in that moment, Julian realized that she was already letting him in, even if just a little bit. She wasn't ready to take the next step, but she was finally starting to trust him. "I'm not asking for everything right now," Julian said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm asking for you to trust me. And if you can do that, we'll figure it out together." Lila nodded, her hand tightening around his. She didn't have all the answers, and neither did he. But for the first time in weeks, Julian felt like there was hope. Maybe this wasn't the moment for love to blossom, but it was the beginning of something important. And he was willing to wait for her, even if it meant taking things slow. Chapter 5. The Vulnerable Heart. The next few days were a blur for Julian. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had with Lila. It felt like a turning point, but not in the way he had imagined. There had been no confession of love, no sudden leap toward something deeper. Instead, there had been an exchange of raw vulnerability, a willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful. Julian understood her need for time. He'd seen it in her eyes, felt it in the hesitation of her touch. But it wasn't easy. Each time they spoke, it felt like there was an invisible wall between them, one that had been there even before they started talking about their feelings. The past she kept hidden, those emotional scars she didn't want to show, was a part of her, and Julian could only stand on the other side of that wall, offering her comfort and patience. Yet, the silence between them grew louder. Lila was still in his life, but there were moments when she pulled back, and it felt like they were drifting, despite the moments they shared. Julian kept telling himself to wait, to be patient, but it was harder than he had ever expected. One Friday afternoon, Julian found himself in the library again, hunched over his books in an attempt to bury his thoughts in his homework. The semester was nearing its end, and he needed to focus. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he looked at it, he saw a text from Lila. "Hey, can I see you tonight? There's something I need to tell you." His heart skipped again. Another message, another moment where things felt like they were about to shift. "Sure." "When and where?" he typed quickly, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. "Meet me at the park at 7 p.m. I'll be by the big oak tree." Julian's mind raced. It was still early, so he tried to focus on his studies, but it was impossible. The uncertainty gnawed at him. What could she need to say now? Would this be the moment when everything changed? Or would it be another conversation about how she couldn't move forward? When 7 p.m. finally arrived, Julian made his way to the park. The evening air was crisp, the sky fading into dusky blues and purples, with stars beginning to appear. The park was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he approached the big oak tree, he spotted her sitting on a bench beneath it. She was wrapped in a dark jacket, her hair tumbling down her shoulders, and she was staring at the ground, lost in thought. "Lila!" Julian's voice cut through the silence. She looked up, and the moment their eyes met, Julian saw something in her gaze he hadn't expected: fear. It was subtle, but it was there. She had something to say, but whatever it was, it seemed to be weighing on her. "Hi," she said, offering a small smile but not standing up. "Thanks for coming." Julian sat down beside her, feeling the tension between them. "Of course," he said softly. "You said you needed to talk." Lila took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as though gathering the strength to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. About being patient, about waiting for me. And I've been trying to figure out if I can give you what you need." Julian's heart pounded in his chest, but he said nothing. He simply listened, allowing her space to speak. "I'm not good at this," she continued, her voice shaky. I'm not good at trusting people. I've always pushed them away when things got too close. It's easier to be alone, you know." Julian nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had always been someone who kept his feelings close, but Lila's walls were so much higher, so much more intricate. "But," she hesitated, "I don't want to keep pushing you away, Julian. I don't want to keep pretending like I'm fine when I'm not." Her words hit him like a wave. Julian could feel the raw honesty in her confession, and he knew deep down that this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But there was a part of him that was afraid too. Afraid of what she might say next. "I don't know if I'm ready to give you everything you deserve," she said, her voice faltering. "But I do know that I want to try. I don't want to keep running from this." Julian's breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was she really saying that she was ready to take that step? "I don't need everything from you right now," he said gently, his heart filled with hope. "I just need you to trust me. Let me be here for you. You don't have to have it all figured out." Lila's eyes glistened as she looked at him, the walls around her slowly crumbling. "I want to trust you," she whispered. "But I'm so scared. I'm scared of hurting you. I'm scared of being vulnerable." Julian reached out, taking her hand in his, offering her the comfort he knew she desperately needed. "We don't have to rush anything," he said softly. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real with me. And I promise, I'll be here for whatever comes next. No matter what." Lila nodded slowly, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her eyes still glistening. "I don't deserve you, Julian. You're so patient with me, and I don't know how to repay that." "You don't need to repay anything," he replied, his thumb gently brushing over her hand. "I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing this because I care about you. And I want to be here, even if it's just to listen, even if it's just to help you heal." Lila looked at him, then really looked at him. And for the first time, Julian saw a spark of something more. Something that wasn't just about the past or the future, but something in the present. Something that made all the uncertainty worth it. "I'm scared, Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want to try with you." Julian squeezed her hand, smiling softly. "We'll figure it out together. One step at a time." They sat in silence for a long time, the world around them quiet as they simply held hands, letting the weight of the moment sink in. For the first time, Julian felt like they were finally on the same page. There was still so much for Lila to work through, so much for them to figure out, but there was hope now. A fragile, beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something more. The night stretched on, and for the first time in a long time, Julian didn't feel afraid of the future. No matter what it held, he knew they could face it together. Chapter 6. The Heart's Quiet Revolution. The weeks following that night at the park were a delicate dance between hope and fear. Julian could feel it in every conversation, every glance they exchanged, and every subtle touch of her hand in his. Lila had finally let him in, just a little, and while he knew that healing would take time, he also felt the deepening of their bond. But this wasn't the same kind of love he had imagined. No passionate confessions, no whirlwind moments of uncontainable joy. Instead, it was something quieter, something more steady, a slow burn that had the potential to become something profound. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were moments when Lila seemed distant, retreating back into herself, as though her past was too heavy to carry. Julian noticed these moments, those tiny cracks in her composure that she tried so hard to hide. But he had learned to be patient, to give her space when she needed it, and to stand by her when she reached out. They spent time together in little ways. Long afternoons in the library studying side by side, occasional dinners at the small cafe near campus, late-night walks beneath the stars. It was in these quiet moments that they began to build something more, something that wasn't rushed or forced. It was simple, but it was real. And yet, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was still holding Lila back. She had confided in him about her past, but she still held certain parts of herself at arm's length. Whenever the conversation veered too close to deeper emotions or the future, she would retreat, either changing the subject or making some excuse to leave. Despite all this, Julian had learned to be content with where they were. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need a grand declaration of love from her. All he wanted was to be there for her, to give her the time she needed, and to see if they could grow together naturally without the pressure of expectations. It was on a particularly crisp afternoon in early December when things shifted again. The campus was blanketed with a light dusting of snow, and the trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky like fingers. Julian and Lila had decided to meet at their usual spot, the little cafe on the corner. Lila had texted him earlier that day, saying she wanted to talk. As much as Julian hated the uncertainty of those words, he couldn't deny the flutter of hope that rose in his chest. Maybe this was the moment. Maybe it was time for them to take that next step. When he arrived at the cafe, Lila was already sitting at a table by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She looked up when he walked in, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. But there was something else in her eyes, something deeper, something that made Julian's heart race with anticipation. He sat down across from her, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them filled with the weight of unspoken words. "I've been thinking," Lila said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as though she were testing the waters. "About us. About what we're doing." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lila set her coffee cup down carefully, her fingers tracing the rim as she gathered her thoughts. "I don't know if I'm ready to be in a relationship. I still have so much I need to work through. And I don't want to drag you into something that might fall apart." Julian felt a pang of disappointment, but he pushed it down, forcing a calm smile onto his face. "I understand, Lila. You don't have to be ready right now. We're taking things slow, and that's okay. I'm not asking for anything more than what you're comfortable with." Lila looked at him then, her eyes intense, almost searching, as though trying to gauge his reaction. "No, Julian," she said quietly. "I think I am ready. I think I want to try." His heart stuttered in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I've been pushing you away for so long," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I thought I wasn't ready for this, for something real. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being vulnerable, scared of letting someone in. But I can't keep living like that. I want to be open with you, Julian. I want to see where this can go. I want to be with you if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, and Julian's breath caught. For so long, he had waited for her to take that step, to let down her guard. And now, here she was, offering him exactly that. Her heart, her trust, her willingness to try. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The world outside the window, the worries that had plagued him in the past, none of it mattered. It was just the two of them in this moment, sharing something that felt real and fragile and beautiful. "I don't want to rush you," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "We can take this one step at a time, Lila. I'm not going anywhere. But I'm so glad you're here with me." Lila smiled, a mixture of relief and joy crossing her face. "I'm scared, Julian," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm more scared of losing you." "You won't lose me," he promised. "Not now. Not ever." And in that moment, Julian realized that what they had was more than just a fleeting crush or a passing infatuation. It was something that had grown between them, something built on patience, trust, and vulnerability. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be without its challenges, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Julian felt a quiet kind of certainty. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Later that night, as Julian walked back to his dorm, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had always been afraid of the unknown, the what-ifs, the uncertainties. But with Lila, he realized that sometimes it wasn't about knowing everything. It was about taking that first step and trusting that the path would reveal itself along the way. And so, with a quiet heart, he let himself believe that this, whatever this was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 7. The burden of secrets. The winter break was fast approaching, and with it came a sense of quiet anticipation. Julian and Lila had been growing closer, slowly but steadily. Lila was opening up to him more, bit by bit, and Julian had learned to be patient. They still spent most of their time in small moments. Long walks through the snow-covered campus, late-night study sessions where they both tried to ignore the pull of each other's presence, and quiet conversations over cups of coffee. It was a subtle shift, but Julian could feel it. Something had changed between them. Lila had stopped retreating into herself so much. She had started to let him in. Yet, even as they grew closer, there was always something lingering. A shadow that hung just beyond the edge of their conversations, something that Lila refused to address directly. Julian could feel it in the way she sometimes went quiet, in the way her smiles would falter at times when he least expected it. There were nights when Julian lay awake, thinking about it, wondering what it was that she was still holding on to. He knew that there was something from her past that haunted her, something that had caused the walls she had built around her heart. But every time he asked, every time he gently prodded, she would retreat, as though the very question itself was too painful to answer. He couldn't force her to open up, but the uncertainty began to eat at him. They had taken so many steps forward, and yet there was still this invisible barrier between them, a barrier she wasn't ready to tear down. One evening, just a few days before the start of winter break, Lila invited him to dinner. It was unexpected, but Julian was thrilled. They usually kept things casual, but this felt different. Lila had suggested a nice Italian restaurant on the edge of town, a place they'd never been to before, and she seemed eager about the idea. He got ready quickly, trying to shake off the nerves that had crept up on him. He knew it wasn't just about the dinner. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite place. When he arrived at the restaurant, Lila was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She was dressed in a sleek black sweater and jeans, her hair tied up in a messy bun. Julian couldn't help but smile when he saw her. She looked radiant, even though there was a slight tension in her posture that he hadn't noticed before. "Hey!" he greeted her, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. "Hey!" Lila responded, her voice softer than usual. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to decide whether to say something. They ordered their food, and the conversation flowed easily at first. They spoke about finals, about plans for the break, and about how much they were both looking forward to some time away from campus. But there was an undercurrent to the evening, a palpable sense that something was weighing on Lila's mind. As the waiter brought their food, Julian decided it was time to bring it up. He had to know. The question had been sitting on his chest for too long. "Lila," he said gently, his tone soft, "is there something you're not telling me?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, he saw that familiar hesitation flash across her face. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she picked up her glass of water and took a sip, her gaze shifting toward the window. "I know you've been holding back," Julian continued, his voice steady. "I don't want you to feel like you have to tell me everything, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel the distance sometimes. I don't know what it is, Lila. And it's okay if you're not ready to tell me, but I need to know if there's something more going on." Lila didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared down at her plate, twirling her pasta around her fork, avoiding his gaze. The silence between them stretched on, long and uncomfortable, before she finally spoke. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian leaned in slightly, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Lila's hand trembled as she set her fork down on the plate. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering the courage to speak. "I've been hiding something from you. Something that's been with me for a long time, and it's not easy for me to talk about." Julian's chest tightened as he leaned back in his chair. "Whatever it is, Lila, I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be afraid of telling me." Lila nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. "It's not just something I can get over. It's something that's part of who I am. And it's not fair to you. It's not fair to drag you into it when I'm still struggling with it myself. Julian reached across the table, taking her hand in his heart hammering in his chest. You don't have to do it alone. You don't have to carry this by yourself. Whatever it is, I want to be here for you. She finally met his gaze, her eyes wet with unshed tears. I was in an abusive relationship before I came to college, she said, her voice trembling. It was a nightmare. And even though I've tried to move on, I still can't shake the effects it had on me. I have trouble trusting people, Julian. I have trouble believing that someone could love me without wanting something from me in return. I don't know how to stop feeling broken. The words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He had suspected that Lila's past was painful, but hearing the truth, hearing her say it out loud, shook him to his core. He couldn't imagine the pain she must have endured, the scars she carried, and the strength it took just to get to this point. Lila, he said softly, his voice full of tenderness. I'm so sorry. Had no idea. I had no idea how much you've been carrying. She squeezed his hand, her tears falling freely now. I'm scared, Julian. I'm scared that I'll never be able to trust anyone fully again. I'm scared that I'll push you away, that I'll hurt you without meaning to. Julian wiped a tear from her cheek, his heart aching for her. You don't have to worry about that. I'm not going anywhere. We can take this one step at a time. We don't have to rush anything. I just want to be here for you, Lila. The raw vulnerability in her eyes broke something inside of him. He realized then that their journey together wasn't just about love. It was about healing. It wasn't going to be easy, but Julian was willing to be there, to help her through the pain, to help her find peace with herself. I'm not perfect, Julian, Lila said, her voice barely audible now. But I'll try. I'll try for us. And in that moment, Julian knew that their relationship was about to change. Was already changing. It wasn't about fixing her or making everything perfect. It was about learning to love each other in the midst of imperfections, about understanding the weight of the past and giving each other the grace to move forward. Julian smiled softly, his heart full of compassion. You don't have to try for us, Lila. You just have to be you. That's all I've ever wanted. The night ended with the two of them walking through the quiet streets of town, their hands tightly intertwined. The snow was falling lightly around them, blanketing the world in a soft, quiet glow. For the first time in a long time, Lila allowed herself to lean into the warmth of Julian's presence. She didn't have to be fixed. She just needed to be loved. Chapter 8. The Crossroads. Winter break passed quickly, a blur of quiet moments and emotional revelations. The weight of Lila's past still hung in the air, but there was a different energy now. They were no longer just two people walking side by side in the dark. Julian had come to understand the depths of her pain, and instead of retreating, he had leaned in closer. He had learned to be patient with her, to give her the space she needed, and above all, he had learned to love her, not in spite of her struggles, but because of them. The vulnerability she had shown him only deepened his affection for her. They spent the holiday break in their own ways, but they stayed in touch. They texted and called when they could, and when they were together, it felt like a delicate kind of peace had settled between them. There was no rush anymore, no pressure to be something they weren't ready for. Just the quiet acknowledgement that they were both trying, in their own ways, to heal and grow. But as the new semester approached, so did a sudden shift, a change that neither of them could have predicted. It was a Sunday afternoon when Lila asked him to meet her at their usual cafe. Julian had just come from a study session, his mind filled with the weight of his upcoming exams. He couldn't help but notice the odd tension in the air when she had texted him earlier, saying she needed to talk. But he also knew that when it came to Lila, talking was never something to be afraid of. They had shared so much with each other already, and this would be no different. When he arrived, he immediately noticed something was different. Lila was already sitting at their usual spot by the window, but her posture was rigid, her gaze fixed on the mug in front of her. She wasn't looking up when he sat down, and the air between them felt charged in a way Julian couldn't place. "Hey," Julian said gently, reaching for her hand across the table. Lila looked up then, her eyes tired, but there was something more, a kind of weariness in them that Julian had never seen before. She smiled weakly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hi," she replied softly. Julian's heart tightened in his chest. He knew something was off, and a quiet dread began to settle in his stomach. "You okay?" he asked, his voice careful. Lila took a deep breath, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. For a long moment she said nothing. And then, finally, she met his gaze, and the words that came next hit Julian harder than he had ever anticipated. "I think we need to take a break, Julian." Julian froze. The world seemed to stop for a moment. He couldn't process what she had just said. He had imagined many things in his mind over the past few months, many different scenarios where their relationship could face challenges, but this was something he hadn't prepared for. "What?" His voice came out more strained than he intended. Lila looked away, her eyes falling to the table, as though she couldn't bear to look at him directly. "I've been thinking about this a lot, and I need time to figure things out. I'm not sure if I'm ready to keep moving forward with us. I've been holding back so much, and I don't want to keep hurting you." Julian could hear the pain in her voice, the hesitation, and the confusion. He could see how difficult this was for her, but the words still felt like a punch to his gut. "I don't understand," he said, his heart pounding. "We've been making progress. You've been opening up to me. What's changed?" "I've changed," Lila replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle this. I thought I could handle us. But I don't know anymore. I still have so many issues I need to work through, and I don't want to drag you into this. You deserve someone who's whole, Julian. Someone who's ready. And right now, I'm not sure I am." Julian's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. He had been patient, he had given her space to heal, and he had been there for her through every up and down. But now it felt like he was losing her, not because of anything he had done, but because of the things she couldn't quite let go of within herself. "I'm not asking for perfection, Lila," he said, his voice cracking. "I just want to be with you. I want to be here for you no matter what. We've both been through so much, but I thought we could figure this out together." "I want to believe that too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep dragging you along when I'm not sure of where I'm going. I don't want to hurt you anymore. I need space. Time to figure things out." The words were like a final blow. Julian felt as if the ground had slipped from beneath him. This wasn't what he had imagined. He had thought that, after everything, they had reached a place of understanding, that they had crossed the bridge from uncertainty to something real. But now, all those doubts, all the fears that had been lingering in the back of his mind, were suddenly resurfacing. "I don't want to lose you," Julian said, his voice raw with emotion. "You're not losing me," Lila said quickly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm not going anywhere. I need to figure out who I am without all of this. Without the weight of the past. Without constantly wondering if I'm good enough for you." Julian sat back in his chair, his hands clenching into fists on the table. His heart ached, but he knew deep down that there was nothing he could say to change her mind. She needed time. She needed space. And he couldn't force her to be ready. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice hollow. Lila reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I never wanted to hurt you." Julian looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of what was happening. He knew that this wasn't the end of their story, but it felt like a crossroads, a moment where everything they had built together was being tested. He squeezed her hand gently. "Take all the time you need, Lila. I'll be here. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'll be here." They sat there in silence for a long time, neither of them knowing what came next. Julian didn't know if they would come back from this, but he knew one thing for sure. Love was never simple, and sometimes the hardest thing to do was to let go, even just for a little while. Chapter 9. The Unwritten Future. The following weeks felt like a blur. After their conversation at the cafe, Julian gave Lila the space she had asked for, though every part of him wanted to fight it. He had always been the kind of person who believed in facing things head-on, but now he found himself standing at the edge of an uncertain future, unsure of what to do with the pieces of their relationship that had been left behind. At first, he tried to focus on his studies. The spring semester had begun, and the weight of assignments and exams offered a temporary distraction. But there were moments, silent moments late at night or in the middle of a crowded room, when his mind would drift back to Lila. He missed her laugh. He missed the way her eyes would soften when she looked at him. He missed the quiet assurance of knowing she was there, just a text away, her presence woven into the fabric of his everyday. Despite the distance between them, they still talked. Their messages had become less frequent, less intimate. They would check in, ask about each other's day, but it wasn't the same. There were no more long conversations about their hopes and fears, no more confessions shared over cups of coffee. Instead, there was a polite formality to their exchanges, a careful distance that neither of them could quite bridge. One chilly afternoon in mid-February, Julian sat on a bench outside their campus library, scrolling through notes for an upcoming exam. It had been 3 weeks since their talk, and though he had respected her request for space, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had been thinking a lot about what Lila had said that night, that she wasn't sure of where she was going. Made sense. After all, her past was still such a heavy weight, and maybe she needed to figure out how to carry it on her own before she could let someone else into her life again. Julian was just about to pack up his things when he felt a soft tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find Lila standing there, looking as if she had just walked out of a dream. She was wearing a simple white sweater and jeans, her hair loosely falling around her shoulders. The sight of her stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until that moment. "Hey," she said, her voice hesitant but warm. Julian stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but seeing her there, really seeing her, felt like a jolt to his senses. "Lila," he said, his voice a little rough. "What are you doing here?" I've been thinking," she started, her eyes searching his face. "I know I asked for space, and I've taken a lot of time to figure things out. I think I've realized something important." Julian's pulse quickened. He was afraid to ask, afraid of what her answer might be, but he couldn't help himself. "What's that?" Lila took a deep breath, then looked up at him with a soft but determined expression. "I've been running from things, Julian. Running from my past, from the fear of being vulnerable, from the idea that I'm not worthy of someone like you. But I've come to understand that I don't want to keep running anymore. I want to try. Try with you." His heart stopped for a moment. It felt like everything in him, every emotion, every thought, crashed together in an instant. It was as if the universe had decided to answer his unspoken prayers in one breathtaking moment. "Lila," he whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes steady now. "I'm sure. I'm not perfect, Julian, and I don't have all the answers. But I know I don't want to lose you. I'm ready to face the future, whatever it is, with you." A rush of relief swept over him, followed by a flood of emotion he hadn't realized he was holding back. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, pulling her into a gentle hug. Lila hesitated for only a second before her arms wrapped around him, and in that embrace, everything that had been uncertain seemed to fall into place. "I don't know what comes next," he said softly, his voice muffled by her hair. "But I know that I want to be with you, Lila. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Together." Lila pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Together," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the grand, sweeping love story that either of them had imagined at the start. It wasn't a love built on dramatic moments or perfect timing. Instead, it was a love forged in the quiet understanding of each other's flaws, of the slow, steady process of healing, and of the willingness to give each other the grace to grow. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. Lila had her scars, and Julian had his own. They would face challenges, moments of doubt, and the weight of their pasts. But they were no longer running from those things. They were standing still, together, ready to face whatever came next. They sat together on the bench, the silence between them comfortable now, no longer heavy. The winter air was cold, but the warmth between them felt like something more, something that had taken root over the months of knowing each other, of learning, of growing. And for the first time in a long while, Julian felt a quiet certainty. He didn't need to know what the future held. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was this moment, with Lila beside him, knowing that they had chosen each other, flaws and all. The future for them was unwritten. But for the first time, Julian felt ready to turn the page, to begin the next chapter.